Welcoming everybody, ladies and gentlemen, to the first panel of the session on Bangladesh, prospects and challenges. Let me on the onset tell we are delighted from the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies to partner with the American Security Project in Washington to host this conference on Bangladesh. As the president of ASP mentioned in the morning, that this has rather become a regular event here at ASP because this is exactly after 1 year we are revisiting everything that we discussed about Bangladesh in October last year. And since then, in the last 12 months, a lot of water has flown down the Ganges, both in political terms, in security terms, and economic terms. Some are happy pictures, some are not. In terms of politics, we are going down the road when Bangladesh is rapidly turning into a one-party state. We have grave security challenges, especially the environment of ISIS and AQIS. And happily, we still have a lot of economic prospects, but whether they're sustainable or not, those are the questions. We have a great panel here today for you, and they will be discussing some of the issues I just mentioned. For your information, everything that we are saying here today is on the record. It's also being live tweeted by ASP here in Washington, and we shall be live tweeting back in Dhaka from my institute. So it's live tweeted, it's recorded, so feel free to say anything that you feel like. So our first speaker of the day will be Dr. Piyash Karim. I will not go through the bios, you can see them on the online, but needless to say, Dr. Karim is a university professor in the Bragg University in Dhaka, and one of the most well-known faces in Bangladesh television today because he's active on the talk show circuit, and he's an analyst on both economic and political fronts. So Dr. Karim, you have about 10 to 12 minutes to give your comments.
Thank you. I'm supposed to identify all the major political problems in Bangladesh and offer their solution in 10 to 12 minutes. Yes. This is not going to be an easy task. It's not going to be an easy task. Well, first of all, as the key speaker indicated, I think we have plenty to be proud of in Bangladesh. We are making impressive advancements in terms of healthcare, education. Growth rate is quite impressive, and so on and so forth. But as a gentleman in the audience indicated, and very forcefully indicated, that none of these achievements are sustainable without a sustainable democratic politics. For a number of reasons, the East Asian development state model in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Singapore, to some extent Malaysia, and of course in China, which is based on some kind of a state authoritarianism, state-led authoritarianism, is not going to work in Bangladesh. As the key speaker mentioned, I mean, the democratic spirit is very powerful in Bangladesh. There's a different kind of political tradition. So in the first, last, and the middle instance, democracy is the most crucial political issue faced by Bangladesh right now. And at the risk of, oversimplification, that democracy is in tremendous danger in the country right now. As General Muniruzzam said, Bangladesh is rapidly on its way to becoming a one-party state. Ladies and gentlemen, you probably know about the election that took place in Bangladesh on January 5th. One of the two major political parties, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, did not participate in the election because of its disagreement with the government. I mean, Bangladesh Constitution allowed for a caretaker government to supervise the election. Rather arbitrarily, the previous government basically cancelled that caretaker government provision and ensured that the election takes place under the ruling party. Given the nature of our political culture, given the nature of the political character of our administration, given the nature of our lack of independence of the judiciary branch, it was a foregone conclusion that the election without a caretaker government was not going to be a neutral election. Bangladesh Nationalist Party boycotted the election. Only about 5 to 7% of the people voted in the election. 154 candidates out of 300 were elected without any contestation. There was no contestation. They were elected. In other words, the election was a farce. And since then, the government is ruling the country in a rather quasi-authoritarian way, the human rights are being suppressed. I didn't mean to be too negative about it, and if you want me to get into more details of these issues, if you want me to touch the nuances and the subtleties of the issues, I'll be more than willing to do that during the Q&A session. But I mean, if you look at some of the indicators, if you look at some of the data, and if you look at extrajudicial killing, it's happening all the time. If you look at forced disappearance of citizens, political activists or not. If you look at suppression of political parties who oppose the government policies, if you look at the way the government is trying to control the media, if you look at the way the executive branch and the legislative branch are trying to control the judicial branch of the government through the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, this is not a good time for democracy in Bangladesh. There are major governance issues, there are issues related to corruption. I understand that a post-colonial developing country cannot eliminate corruption overnight. But corruption has totally taken control over every major sphere of social and economic life. And because of that, kind of corruption, there's a small group of people, small group of economic and political elite who have accumulated tremendous amount of wealth that legitimately belong to the common people. Inefficiency, mismanagement, politicization of the bureaucracy, regionalization of the bureaucracy. A significant number of administrative officials are coming from one particular district of the country, the district which happens to be the district of the Prime Minister. Law and order situation is bad. I mean, these are issues that are connected with democracy. But I think very importantly for the discussion today, very important for the prevailing political interest in the global community today, democracy and terrorism are closely interconnected in a very interesting way. We need to fight terrorism. Bangladesh faces the danger of terrorism. What is happening in Syria, what is happening in Iraq, what is happening in Libya, what is happening in other parts of the world may have important impact on Bangladesh. But how do you fight terrorism? No country in the world has been able to fight terrorism solely through law and order measures. I mean, you can have powerful secret police, you can have armed militia, but terrorism is a multifaceted, complex issue. You're not going to be able to address terrorism through law and order measures only. What you need for a successful battle against terrorism is a democratic political culture. What you need is a democratic consensus. What you need is a way of channelizing the social frustrations and resentments through some kind of a legitimate constitutional process. And for, because of the lack of democracy in Bangladesh right now, that is not what is going to happen. The government is trying to push the legitimate opposition party, BNP, to the wall. The government is trying to make sure that none of the activities of BNP can take place without severe governmental restrictions. But remember, nature abhors vacuum. I mean, if a legitimate moderate democratic party like Bangladesh Nationalist Party or any other political party are not allowed to work in a free, open political space, somebody is going to occupy the political space. And at this point, militancy is a tangible issue. Militancy is a force that might occupy that political space, which is not going to be good for Bangladesh, which is not going to be good for the region, and definitely is not going to be good for the global community. So, whether we talk about economic growth, whether we talk about economic sustainability, and speaking of economic growth, we know that economic growth does not only mean per capita growth rate, it also means a fair redistribution of resources, it also means people's sense of empowerment, it also means the way citizens feel secure within the culture. And none of these things are going to happen without democracy. So, to repeat myself, in the first, the last, and the middle instance, democracy is the most crucial political issue facing Bangladesh. And in a way, I mean, it is not only an issue in Bangladesh, it's an issue in a broad range of post-colonial societies. Now, what America can do about it? In a globalized context, no national politics is absolutely national politics. Every national politics has important global ramifications. If Bangladesh becomes unstable, that is going to have impact on the US security. If Bangladesh a country of 160 million people cannot sustain a legitimate political order that is going to have all kinds of implications for the global community. So the security problem in Bangladesh, the problem of democracy in Bangladesh is never a purely national problem. For the very pragmatic reason, of course, and also for ethical reasons, because I think the United States has a long history of being committed to democracy all over the world. And I don't mean to be too uncritical of US foreign policy. The United States has messed up big time in many parts of the world too. And we all know the critiques of US foreign policy. But the United States has important roles to play in the promotion of democracy on a global scale. And Bangladesh is a case that the United States cannot afford to ignore. It's not a question of dragging the United States into Bangladesh. It's never that simple. Whether the United States knows it or not, whether the United States wants to recognize it or not, the United States is already a part of the game. Because if Bangladesh becomes unstable, South Asia becomes unstable. If South Asia becomes unstable, the United States is not going to have a happy existence, geopolitically speaking, economically speaking. So I'll urge the people who are in the audience, I'll urge the policymakers, I'll urge the activists, please tell your friends, please tell your organizations, please tell your audience, whatever that audience is, that democracy is a severe problem in a country which is globally known to be a moderate Muslim country. I mean, if you compare Bangladesh with Iraq, Syria, or other parts of the world, Bangladesh has a fantastic opportunity to synthesize the spirit of liberal democracy with a historical sense of religion and tradition. And instability is going to spoil the beautiful synthesis. It's going to ruin the beautiful combination. And as global citizens, we cannot afford to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karim, for your comments. Our next panelist will be Dr. Leach. Dr. Leach has a very distinguished bio, and I am tempted to go through it, but for the sake of time, I cannot do that. Only to say that he is a distinguished research fellow for South Asia and the Near East in the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute of National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington. I know Dr. Leach is going to talk about some of the regional issues and sub-regional issues, especially touching on security of the region and of Bangladesh. So Dr. Leach, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman here, and thank you to both the American Security Progress and the Bangladesh Institute for Peace and Security Studies, each of which I've had a very profitable relationship with for going on half a decade now, and a personal relationship with Shafkat going back even beyond that. So it's great to be here. Thanks to you and thanks to the ASP hosts. Let me highlight that even though I work for a Department of Defense entity at the National Defense University, my comments here to you today are based on my own personal research and conclusions and do not represent the official position of either the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So with that obligatory disclaimer, let me tell you that what I hope to do here in a brief 10 minutes or so is to fill a niche amongst the distinguished speakers you have here from within the region, based on research that I and a colleague have done over the last 3 years, which has to do with understanding and situating Islamic militancy and terrorism in the northeastern subcontinent. So what I'm going to highlight for you today is the combinations of writings that I have done, some of which have been done for sponsors within the Department of Defense, and also writings that have been done by this colleague, and indeed an esteemed colleague, who many of you may already know, Stephen Tankel, who is considered perhaps one of the, if not the most authoritative expert on Lashkar-e-Taiba out of Pakistan. He currently is at American University, although on sabbatical and fellowship this year. And I highlight this because I helped him with the research and the writing of this monograph from my institute. Those of you who wish to look for it on the interwebs, it's called the Indian Jihadist Movement, Evolution and Dynamics. And it has a partner publication, which is done out of the Wilson Center, which was from earlier this year, January of 2014. This was July of 2014, which is a slightly more extensive and expansive recitation of the jihadist threat in India. Well, what I want to extract from this, though, is that the work that was done really belies the name of each of these monographs. The work that was done really had to do with the pattern and the trajectory of Islamic radicalism and terrorism in the northeast subcontinent. So it included interface out of India, into and out of Bangladesh, Nepal, as well as ties or tethers back to organizations in Pakistan. And it's in that space I'd like to spend the remaining 9 minutes or so of my talk, just to talk about some general conclusions. Conclusions which I will offer for you, maybe contrast a bit with the very esteemed comments made by my panelists here, which is kind of how I believe the United States, the United Kingdom, the West, and India actually view the major problems in the Bangladesh region. And a lot of this problem is seen through the lens of the terrorism threat, or the terrorism challenge. And in that context, I think there's a story to be told here, which I will sketch out. We can talk more about question and answer, hopefully in some detail, which is a pattern of progress within Bangladesh, but also a pattern of challenge moving forward. Kind of a creation of breathing space from what had been perceived, particularly in New Delhi and in Washington and London, as a real problem, which Stephen Tankel highlighted in the monograph I've shown you here in his writing based upon his 2012 research, where he said, until recently, Bangladesh was seen as a major transit point for Indian and Pakistani militants. Bangladeshi-based HUGIB or UGB and Lashkar-e-Taiba LET operatives often facilitated their travel, with ISI sometimes providing passport money and assistance, intervening with local Bangladeshi authorities when necessary. However, since the arrival of Sheikh Hasina's Bangladeshi Awami League administration in office in early 2009, such activity has shrunk significantly. In recent years, Indian authorities have begun to worry more about Nepal, which they see as a growing transit point for people executing terrorist attacks in India and across the Northeast. So, that is kind of the where Bangladesh was perceived. And indeed, if one looks at the history of Bangladesh back into the early 2000s and right the way through the government transition of 2009, interlocutors that I've worked with, not only in India, but in intelligence and terrorist services in the United Kingdom, the United States, as well as Western Europe, really pointed to the government. At that time, the Bangladeshi National Party government, with an interim period where the army took over, as being far too tolerant and far too complicit with the elements of Islamic militancy, particularly the Jaish organization within Bangladesh, and that had allowed the growth of the JMB. Okay? And for those of you that are students of Bangladesh, the JMB then provided its own underpinning problem, where in 2005 there were a series of explosions across the peaceful and cooperative Bangladesh that really shocked the system, right? That led to people questioning inside and outside, led to many people actually turning to Indians who had been complaining for better part of a half a decade to 9 years that this facilitation hub through Bangladesh was what was causing the majority of the problems within India. Now let me assure you that the conclusions of Stephen Tankel and my own writing are that Indian problems with militancy are in many cases, if not most cases, homegrown, and that if one were to strip away any type of facilitation nodes in Bangladesh, or Pakistani facilitators, or Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Taiba facilitators, India would still have a Mujahideen problem. But as Stephen Tankel concludes, many of the governments involved in working with security and terrorism were deeply concerned that the BNP, and to a lesser extent at that time, some in the Bangladeshi army were in too deep. The elbows were too deep into the Islamic jihadi pot, and the arrival of Sheikh Hasina produced a rapprochement, a change in interaction that I want to highlight for you, because I think the period from 2009 to 2013 can be argued as one of great and positive interactive cooperation between the government of Bangladesh and the governments of particularly India, the United States, and the UK. And the evidence of that comes when one looks at kind of the piece parts to the growing, ever-growing interaction between the Bangladeshi military and police and security services and these governments. First and foremost, the United Kingdom, which had had a long-standing intelligence corroboration, by June of 2009 had approached Bangladesh and established a joint working counterterrorism group that really facilitated police and intelligence cooperation, and led the UK, starting in 2009, to really provide some concentrated and focused energy on the process of aviation security and also intelligence collection security within Bangladesh. And indeed, several authors since that time that I've used in my writing have highlighted that this cooperation and collaboration really has helped, particularly along the inter-Indian-Bangladesh border in East Bengal, kind of clear out some of those areas that really were facilitative hubs, perceived facilitative hubs of those who were transiting for terrorist activities across the Indian border into other parts further south. the terrorists particularly were appearing to be facilitated by actors from Lashkar-e-Taiba. Let me make that clear, that there was facilitation ongoing from outside. Second, the 2009 change really changed in many ways the relationship between India's intelligence and security services and Bangladesh. Now, I think one needs to curb one's enthusiasm here, okay? There are many, many reasons why there are self-limitations on the cooperation and collaboration between Indian intelligence services and police services and Bangladesh, okay? And none of the work or the writing that I and my colleague have done on this are in any way intending to whitewash or minimize that. Those still exist. But if one looks from 2009 to 2013, one can point to the fact that the India-Bangladeshi partnership under Sheikh Hasina can be argued to be the most important partnership in building trust and in having success, particularly the establishment of collection exchanges between the Indo police force and those in Bangladesh and Dhaka has led to the determination and the apprehension by the Bangladeshi police detective branch, particularly the one in Dhaka, of well over, this is by Indian accounts, well over 36 known or significant Lashkar-e-Taiba facilitators of Islamic militant activity between 2009 and 2012. All right? And so there were significant arrests and significant turn-ins that had occurred in the part of that cooperation. By 2010, India and Bangladesh had established a coordination committee on counterterrorism, which has been subsequent to that kind of the facilitative node, and has led to a lot of the denouement, if one will, of significant operatives that Stephen Tankel's sentence that I read to you really has characterized the way in which that relationship has been seen. Indeed, many people point to the fact that the very tribunals that are ongoing now have been helped and facilitated by this intelligence cooperation and collaboration, not only between India and Bangladesh, but also between the UK and Bangladesh. Indeed, that some elements and bits of evidence that might otherwise have been unapproachable in the court system have been made available and shared through the collaboration that has occurred extensively with the Hussein government since 2009. Now the United States. Okay? The United States also took to the arrival of the Sheikh Hasina government as a positive step in helping the way forward. But the United States had a few other hurdles to get over here. The United States had to deal with the fact that there's some laws on the books that minimize the way in which any of our agencies in the government can assist foreign militaries that have not been deemed fully compliant with human rights. And in this area, for reasons both understandable and in some case explainable, the Bangladesh military, had some hurdles to overcome. Well, by 2010, working with the Sheikh Hasina government, the United States was able, and particularly our State Department, to overcome some of those standing barriers and hurdles and establish, therefore, an anti-terrorism assistance program, which largely is focused on the development of police officers and the Dhaka military, the Dhaka police service particularly, which has included VIP protection, crime scene management, SWAT activities, particularly in the Dhaka area themselves, and as well as a kind of a border counterterrorism interface that is undergirded, and I think the general can allude to this himself, has undergirded a lot of the collaboration between the current Bangladeshi military and special operations forces from the United States and others. So, I think when one looks at the challenges politically within, there's this interesting juxtaposition, if not actually kind of a one-off reversal when one looks at it from the outside in. From the outside in, this government, for whatever challenges it's had with its own democratic development, is perceived in Delhi, in London, and certainly in Washington as being a much preferred government in terms of the trade and transit of militancy, terrorism, and the facilitative finances, foreign fighters and others going across not only into India, but also transiting into Muslim areas in the Gulf region. So I think that's one dimension of the security area, and that's progress. And it's progress that has led people like Stephen Tankel and myself, as well as others, to conclude that many of the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed networks that were facilitative of terrorist activity in that region have been broken over the course of the last 6 years. Now, broken does not mean gone, however. And here's where I wanted to turn the last several minutes of my remarks to kind of the space that's been created and the challenge that's there. And indeed, we've seen that challenge rise. And I think Shafkat's going to talk about some of this in terms of internal radicalization, so I won't go there in terms of Bangladesh. But I'll tell you where I and my work has seen the rise as I track kind of the more Islamic terrorist clusters, not only in my work on South Asia, but the work I also do on the Middle East. And that is in terms of the fact that the radicalized polity that still exists in Bangladesh, certainly a large subset of it having to do with people without economic opportunity, without sufficient education, but also, let's be honest, a large measure of it that's right at university, that's well educated and may lack opportunity. Being a very strong target audience for two types of international jihadi terror networks. The first one, which has been present now for about 2 to 2.5 years, and that is what I call the indiscriminate use by ISIS or ISIL, take your choice, of standard and unencrypted forms of social media to outreach and to appeal to disaffected Muslims in every country, to include Bangladesh, and in their language, to pick up the fight and fight the infidels and come to Western Iraq and Syria to join that fight. And here, whereas the Al-Qaeda networks of the past have been much more discriminate in my read, in my study, in terms of where they target their message and where not, ISIL has been highly indiscriminate. All right, and there's some positives to that for law enforcement, but there are also some negatives for countries that are trying to grapple in this space for the first time, Bangladesh being amongst them, but not alone, India too. And here I point to the fact of what's been referred to as the Mumbai Four, right, which is a group of young Muslims from north of Mumbai who were appealed to apparently in early 2014, took the call from ISIS, transited the Middle East, and then were found in Mosul in Iraq, working on behalf of ISIS in largely administrative and functional areas. But this was a new experience for India, a very new experience. India had not seen that before, and India felt itself kind of inoculated from that. And my only comment, again, in terms of looking at regional dimensions is, if India is vulnerable to this, other countries in the region are highly vulnerable to this, Bangladesh amongst them. And that is this indiscriminate appeal and this desire to have folks come and fight that fight there, who then can, and in some cases will, be those who return to the country and may have even more radicalized tendencies. And so that's a challenge. The second part of the challenge is, into this space that's kind of been semi-vacated by Lashkar-e-Taiba and other state-led jihadists that ISIS has appealed to, there is also the appeal now from Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent, which we can talk about question and answers, but my read is, after initially seeing this announcement and having tracked for the last decade Al-Qaeda and its operations, I was like, wow, this is a real change. Because the Al-Qaeda of bin Laden would not appeal directly to the Hindu nation to fund and arm itself to then combat the Hindu state. This, if you read carefully what bin Laden and Zawahiri had done as far as disciplining Al-Qaeda core, this was to be a tertiary issue. Right? That first you drive the Western infidels off, causing the apostate governments to topple, then you dealt with the Shia, and then you would have enough of a force to take care of the Hindu state. But you didn't want to piss the Hindu state off right now while you're dealing on all these other fronts. So I was like, wow, I mean, has Zawahiri gone back on this? Is he now really appealing? But then after the first splash of headlines, I and some of my colleagues who read Urdu went back in and really read the message, and my interpretation of it is it's old wine in new skins. But what it is it's the desire to say, especially to the Muslim population of northern India, of Pakistan, and of Bangladesh, hey, don't leave South Asia and go fight over there. We have a fight for you here. And it's about to be a winning fight, because those Americans are about to leave Afghanistan. We got this emir in waiting called Omar, and that's where you want to focus your attention on. And yes, we care about your causes against your government in Dhaka, and your government in Delhi, and your government in Kathmandu. But you must stay with us. Don't leave the team. Don't go to those characters. Stay with us here, and we will put you on the path to righteous jihad and make this happen. So, I mean, I think after the initial breathlessness about this released message, I think a more sober analysis is that's what's going on. But having said that, that's still a challenge in Bangladesh, because it is now more of a direct and open appeal to disaffected Bangladeshi Muslims to stay with and fight the fight in the region. And the blowback potential, as well as the efforts perhaps by Al-Qaeda to fill that space of transiting money and fighters and finance, that space is now, I would argue to you, being contested by those who answer more to Al-Qaeda Central. And in competition with those, I don't want to make too much of it because I don't think there are too many of those in Bangladesh or South Asia right now. There's a virtual presence by ISIS, but I don't see too many, Iraqi nationals there helping to facilitate this exchange. And indeed, most of IS is Iraqi nationals and former Baathists. I don't see that there, but I see this as the new competition and the new challenge. And I think both the government in Bangladesh as well as the government in India are going to be pressed on this, because this is a different game. If you're talking about international jihadi terrorists and how they raise money and they raise finances. And it's a game that Al-Qaeda core hasn't played in as heavily on the Indian subcontinent as perhaps it could have over the last decade. But now that it perceives the space as being challenged by ISIS, now that it perceives, I would argue, they see the space as being vacated by Lashkar-e-Taiba and other associates that were affiliated with the Pakistani state, now I think you have a different case and a different potential for radicalization. And I think some of that in the social media piece, Shafkat might refer to in his comments. So, that's what I would offer to you here as far as comments. The trajectory of Islamic militancy and terrorism in Northeast Asia and how it's been played out between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. Let me just put a tag comment here because I didn't talk Nepal. We can talk in questions. India has also improved its cooperation with Nepal. 2012, 2013 were the big marker years there, where guys that I've tracked for almost a decade that were perceived to be facilitators for Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and other groups in Pakistan were captured in and around the Nepal border, clearly indicating an exchange of information between Nepal intelligence and Indian intelligence that gone beyond what had been there before. And I would argue clearly probably facilitating and being helped by intelligence exchange out of Dhaka to Delhi to intelligence operatives that then were able to go to Nepal and say, hey, we know where these guys are. And the big catch was almost a year ago now, August 17th, 2013, Abdul Karim Tunda, who, if you go back and look at the annals of facilitation of jihad in India and occupation and operation in the space of Bangladesh, this guy goes back all the way to the founding, almost, of Indian Mujahideen as being a chief Lashkar-e-Taiba facilitator. Well, he finally, at almost age 70 and almost 30 years of operation, was suddenly and mysteriously apprehended trying to cross the Nepal border on August 17, 2013 by Indian authorities. That doesn't happen unless you have good collaboration starting to go on between the nations of the region that hadn't been there before. So that's a tag point. Places of cooperation, perspectives by outside governments in this area of militancy and terrorism, what the implications have been for that in terms of a positive appreciation of the Sheikh Hasina government, but also kind of some of the looming darkness on the silver cloud of cooperation. And that is, the vacuum has been opened and there are others kind of willing to fill it right now if there's not a more stable base on which to grow what the professor has talked about, which is prosperous democracy, prosper and opportunities that cause one to not wish to join or throw into jihad. And so with that, sir, I'll leave you with those comments.
We will not have questions now, we'll have questions at the end of the session. Our next speaker on this panel will be Mr. Shafkat Munir, who is an Associate Research Fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies. And he works also very closely with the Bangladesh Center for Terrorism Research, which is the specialist center of my institute. He will be touching on a host of non-traditional security challenges, especially on the terrorist and militancy challenges facing Bangladesh. I shall specially ask Shafkat to running through the chronology of Bangladesh's effort in counterterrorism efforts, which I think is not partisan, it's beyond partisan limits. And my center in the institute has done extensive research on the counterterrorism scene in Bangladesh, and I did not find any efforts by either of the political parties or the Bangladesh military to be complicit in the efforts of the terrorist organizations in Bangladesh. And I see that the city cooperation in Bangladesh does not start as late as 2009 or 10, but it dates back to 2001 and 2. So I would ask Shafkat to specially touch on the chronology of the events and the efforts by the Bangladesh governments and political parties in trying to curb the challenge of militancy and terrorism. So Shafkat, you have the floor for about 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you. Once again, it's a real pleasure to be here at ASP and talking about some of the same issues that I spoke about last year when we were here. As the General said, a lot of water has flown down the Ganges. I think more water has flown down the Ganges vis-a-vis terrorism and extremism, so there is a lot to talk about. But as the Chair mentioned, I think I'd like to begin by giving you a chronological overview of how counterterrorism cooperation between US and Bangladesh has shaped up over the years. It is not a very well-known fact that Bangladesh was one of the first countries in the South Asian region to offer comprehensive cooperation to the United States within hours of the tragedy of September 11, 2001. Not only did Bangladesh extend cooperation in terms of information sharing, but also allowed port access at the early hours of Operation Enduring Freedom. But that is, I think, in fact, not very well known here in Washington, and unfortunately not very well known in Dhaka. Counterterrorism cooperation between the US and Bangladesh, or more broadly between the West and Bangladesh, started right after 9/11, around the period 2002 and 2003, and we saw the completion of a counterterrorism framework agreement between the United States and Bangladesh as early as 2004. I think it is important to underscore at this stage that as we have looked through the history of counterterrorism efforts in Bangladesh, and as I wrote my master's thesis on a comprehensive counterterrorism strategy for Bangladesh, I've looked at it very closely, how the trajectory of counterterrorism has taken place in Bangladesh. It's important to note that successive governments have displayed their willingness and attached importance to the issue of counterterrorism in Bangladesh. So while we can acknowledge that a lot of work has happened over the last few years, but it's also important to acknowledge that the work started before, and the work will continue, irrespective of whether there is a new government in power or not. With that, I think it's important for me to talk about the threat of ISIS and AQIS. Dr. Lynch has briefly touched upon that, but I would like to elaborate on that a bit further. Over the last 3 weeks, we have noticed that there has been a real spike in terms of activity of ISIS recruitment happening in Bangladesh. There were 3 high-profile incidents. One that started with the apprehension of members of Jamaat al-Mujahideen Bangladesh, or JMB, who in their testimony to law enforcement and security agencies admitted that they were in contact with ISIS. Subsequently, we saw reports of Indian nationals being apprehended by the Indian Border Security Force as they were trying to make their way into Bangladesh to meet their ISIL recruiter. And finally, the apprehension of a British Bangladeshi, most recently, just a few days back, during which it was found out that this particular individual was also in the process of being recruited for ISIL and was to be dispatched to Syria. So, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary underscored in the morning, the ISIL threat is not just a threat for the Middle East, but as we see in Bangladesh, it is fast emerging as a threat for various other regions as well, and Bangladesh is particularly susceptible to it. Dr. Lynch has very eloquently touched upon the rivalry that we see emerging between AQIS and ISIL, and that is also becoming a concern for Bangladesh, because we have known Al-Qaeda affiliates operating out of Bangladesh, namely Harkatul Jihad-e-Islami Bangladesh, or HUJB, and any re-emergence of Al-Qaeda in the South Asian region will have strong ramifications for Bangladesh's security. I would like to spend a bit of time talking about the aspect of radicalization among the urban youth and radicalization through social media. The standard sort of understanding of people who were radicalized in the past was they came from a particular socioeconomic background, they were educated in a particular educational system, but of late we see that there has been a sort of sea change in that dynamic. A lot of the newly radicalized individuals that we are encountering now, or we are looking at evidences of, don't belong to a lower socio-income strata, do not come from madrasas in particular, but rather come from, in most cases, an upper middle class background, attend private tertiary institutions, where generally the more well-to-do people of society try to send their children, and belong to a very different group of people in society. In some cases, they're also have had the benefit of a Western education in certain cases. So the aspect of urban radicalization, as we like to call it in Bangladesh, is becoming a major concern for us. Social media has been a tool that has been used quite adroitly by militant organizations in South Asia for quite some time. And Hizb ut-Tahrir in particular, which is an extremist organization, not a terrorist one, has been quite adept in using this. Our organization has analyzed a lot of Hizb ut-Tahrir communication material over the past few months, including some material which was available over the last couple of days, which we have seen. It clearly points out that they're using social media and the internet as an important vehicle to spread their message. HT has been followed in this endeavor by other groups such as Ansarullah Bangla Team, or BEM, which are some of the newer splinter terrorist organizations that have emerged, who are also very adroitly using social media and in the internet to spread their message. A standard refrain that I often hear when I speak about online radicalization in the US and other parts of the West is that Bangladesh is a low broadband penetration country. And I would agree that if we go by statistics of internet or broadband penetration, Bangladesh should probably rank very low, or rather it does rank very low. But a point that is amiss here is that due to the advent of mobile internet, or 3G internet available on cell phones, internet is now available in the remotest corners of the country. So a point that I always like to make is that there are various parts of Bangladesh where you may not have running water or electricity, but you have access to 3G or very soon 4G internet. And that presents a whole other challenge when we talk about online radicalization. Dr. Karim has very eloquently and very rightly pointed out the issue of an emerging democracy deficit in Bangladesh, and I would like to underscore that even further, because in the event that there is an erosion of democracy, as we see that happening in Bangladesh right now with the squeezing of democratic space, and the event of a vacuum coming into existence, that will be extremely dangerous as far as the terrorist and extremist threat in Bangladesh is concerned. I would completely agree with Dr. Karim that nature abhors vacuum, and that vacuum is likely to be filled, or that space is likely to be filled very expeditiously by terrorist and extremist organizations. A lot of work has been done in terms of counterterrorism over the last decade, and the last thing we would like to see as Bangladeshis, that work being undone and that the space filled by militant and extremist organizations. And on that note, I would like to briefly touch upon some of the steps that can be taken on the way forward, and then I would like to spend the remainder of the time talking about the threat from climate change and security. When we talk about counterterrorism efforts in Bangladesh, mere operational success stories are not going to suffice. As a counterterrorism analyst, I acknowledge that operationally, or in terms of kinetic measures, Bangladesh has been one of the trendsetters in South Asia. We have made a lot of progress, but now it is time for us to take a step back, look at the bigger picture, and talk about the strategic piece. What Bangladesh badly needs right now is a comprehensive, multi-party consensus on the issue of counterterrorism, making sure that the triple deficits of democracy, governance, and development are addressed, and finally, a comprehensive counterterrorism architecture. I get a sense of deja vu because exactly 1 year ago I was mentioning about the same thing, about a comprehensive CT architecture, and I'm sorry to say that we haven't seen much progress on that architecture taking shape. And finally, a comprehensive counterterrorism strategy which looks at all these issues. Operationally, we have been quite successful, and we have been able to put a lid on successful attacks, but I would like to emphasize the point that the absence of a terrorist attack, or the absence of a successful terrorist attack, does not denote the absence of the threat of terrorism. I think that's an important marker to keep in mind. With that, I would like to spend the remaining few minutes talking about the threat from climate change and some of the other challenges that Bangladesh faces. According to various studies, including ones done by IPCC and the government of Bangladesh, a 1 meter rise in sea level by the year 2050 will result in the loss of 14 to 20% of Bangladesh's total landmass. An erosion of landmass of 14 to 20%, according to the same study, will consequently result in the displacement of almost 45 million people, mainly in the southwestern parts of the country. And what I would like to say here, I mean, climate migration is obviously a major issue, and ASP does some stellar work on that. But what is important to keep in mind in this context is the kind of state stability issues that will throw open. As these individuals who have been displaced as a result of sea level rise will be looking for higher ground and a new livelihood, we would have issues of them spilling over into India, and that will open a whole new set of challenges vis-a-vis Indo-Bangladesh relations. So climate change is not only a socio-economic threat for Bangladesh, but it is a tremendous security challenge for Bangladesh, and one that has regional ramifications. The other point, I think both speakers very rightly pointed out, that what happens in Bangladesh has implications for the wider region. Dr. Lynch has talked about some of the issues of terrorism in Bangladesh and its implications for India. And I was quite startled by a piece of news that I saw this morning, which happened over the last couple of days, of reports that one of the militant organizations in Bangladesh, JMB, carrying out operations inside Indian territory or getting help from parts of the West Bengal state in India. So it is an urgent need to probe some of these linkages, and while we note that there is a lot of conversations happening between Bangladesh and India on counterterrorism cooperation, with the backdrop of ISIL and AQIS, we need to be having those conversations with Naypyidaw or Myanmar. With the stateless population in the Rakhine region, namely the Rohingyas, I think the ISIL issue has presented both Bangladesh and Myanmar with a new challenge, and there's a greater need for counterterrorism cooperation to take place between Bangladesh and Myanmar. The other issue that we need to keep in mind is that Bangladesh is beset by a plethora of various challenges. Developmental challenges, governance challenges, challenges of food security, energy security, etc. And therefore, under such resource constraints, it is often quite difficult for the authorities in Bangladesh to devote time, energy, and resources to terrorism. And that's where the aspect of international cooperation comes into play. As I have mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, we have had a very robust history of counterterrorism cooperation between Bangladesh and the United States and other Western countries. But we would like to see that cooperation, particularly between Bangladesh and the United States, flourish in the coming months and years. And especially as we we share the same threat perception vis-a-vis ISIL or AQIS, I think there's a greater need to enhance that cooperation. I think I'll stop there, and that will leave us some time for Q&A.
Thank you, Shafkat. I would like to say and share with you the chronology of events that Shafkat laid out before you on the city cooperation between Bangladesh and the United States and other partners in the world. The current legal framework for city in Bangladesh, counterterrorism legal framework, or the legal infrastructure, was laid in Bangladesh around the year 2004, 5, 6. All the current laws of counterterrorism were enacted then. The SARC Convention on Counterterrorism was floated by Bangladesh, approved and ratified by the Bangladesh Parliament around the year 2005. Our cooperation with the United States dates back to 2001. We have deep cooperation on city with the United States dating back to 1. Our current capacity to handle city issues, especially through the elite force RAB, was created in 2005. So I would just like to lay before you some of the historical facts, because we as analysts, we don't look at parties, we look at facts and figures. And I would strongly like to say that our facts and figures indicate that both major political parties in Bangladesh have taken a robust stand against fighting terrorism, and they have had tremendous contribution in building the current infrastructure both in terms of capacity, in terms of legal infrastructure, in terms of international cooperation, in building the infrastructure by which we have been able to fight it so far. With that brief addition to the comment made by Shafkat, I would like to now open the floor for questions and comments. Please feel free to ask anything, and just introduce yourself to the speakers. Okay, we have Mr. Ansari. Can you have the microphone here? And please be very brief so that we have time for more questions.
Mr. Thomas, I am not the right person to oppose your speech, but I would like to say that your speech have some serious number of gaps. I am a journalist from Bangladesh. I would like to mention that the first time take necessary initiative against the terrorists, especially the Houthi, done by BNP government. They persecuted and hanged up the most of the senior Houthi member. But you didn't mention this type of information in your speech. I don't know why you not mention. You all credit you give the running government. I would like to mention that the senior leader from Houthi, the relative of Awami League senior leader. Here, Mr. Being person, here I would like to say something about the real situation.
I think please be very brief.
I would like to say that in terms of eradicate the terrorism from Bangladesh, USA should have seen on his own eyes, not others countries' eyes. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions and then turn back to our panelists.
Sorry, can we identify where he was from again, please?
Would you identify yourself? Identify yourself.
I am from Bangladeshi journalist, Equation Television.
Okay. The lady over there.
Hi, Shamaruk Mohidin with US Bangladesh Advisory Council and Lift Up Asia. Some questions that I guess keep in mind from each of your remarks. To Shafkat, what do you think would be the reason for the urban youth becoming more radicalized? Is it because of the increased sophistication of some of these groups reaching out through social media, or some other kind of change within the Bangladeshi society or demographics? To Dr. Karim, you talked a lot about the decreasing space for opposition. At the same time, it seems that from other countries' eyes, one government is seen to be as more effective in counterterrorism efforts. How do you think we can create this democratic consensus, given that if terrorism kind of trumps other issues and there is increasing cooperation between other governments and the Bangladesh government, where is some of this outside pressure going to come from to really kind of emphasize on the democratic principles? And to Dr. Lynch, maybe talk a little bit more about maybe the opposition's efforts on the counterterrorism front as well. I think that kind of goes with what General Muniruzzam said about each of the parties kind of playing a role in doing that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chaudhary.
Thank you very much. My name is Amir Kasri Mohammed Chaudhary. As a matter of fact, I was not going to speak at all, but I think certain controversies is a reason I did one of the panelists comment. But I'm glad I think Shafkat and General Muniruzzam has clarified the contribution of the both major parties to combat terrorism in Bangladesh. I don't want to dwell in details because there's not enough time for that. But actually it all started during Awami League regime. If you remember the bombing of Udichi, these cultural groups were conducting some shows there, and followed by many occasions of terrorist activities that started. And after the BNP government came in 2001, it really, to start it, I have to admit, it was in little denial about this terrorist issue. It took the issue as a local political problem in the northern part of the country, but soon realized that it was not a local political issue, it was a genuine terrorist problem for the country. And BNP started going all out, practically all out, to go after this terrorist group. They were charged, they were arrested, they were prosecuted, and they were executed. In fact, it was done all during the terms of BNP. The execution took place after the military-backed regime came soon after that. The problem is the difference between Awami League and BNP. BNP never made it a political capital. What Awami League did, you see, they tried to make it a political capital because, more so now, because there is a legitimacy problem with the current government. It is an unelected parliament and unelected government. So they are in a legitimacy drive. So in order to sustain this illegitimate government, the one political capital they are now playing with is this terrorist issue. And you see, from time to time you'll find some terrorists getting arrested. They will be lined up with the nameplates on the chest, some arms in front, photographs will be taken, and it will be shown in the television and in the newspaper. And this is a series of parade of this exercise is going on in the country. But the interesting thing is, if you really follow up, what happened to these arrests? In most cases, you'll find these terrorists were to be released later on. And some of them getting arrested again and again, and this session of photography with the nameplates on their chest and the arms of God knows what type of arms, and in front of them the photographs are going on and on. So this is actually the Panelists comment came out of such political propaganda. And this propaganda is nothing but to sustain the illegitimate government. But what harm this is doing to the nation is the credibility of fighting the terrorists. Because due to these sort of exercises, people start to laugh when they see the television, in the newspaper, this sort of arrest with the photograph of the nameplate on the chest and some arms in front, people start not to believe this. There's a big credibility gap occurring in the country, and people clearly realize this is nothing but to sustain this illegitimate government in the power, which came through power with the state terrorism. Because there was no election, and when I say state terrorism, I mean there's a set of policemen, a set of RAB guys, a set of government administration.
So can you be brief?
I'm being very brief. What I'm trying to drive here is this: a government which is in power through state terrorism, by oppressing and suppressing its own citizens, how can it fight the terrorists? The state has become terrorist to grab the power to stay there. In such state, such a government can never fight the terrorist in its honest purpose. That's my point.
Thank you. So, we have the gentleman at the corner of the back.
Thank you. AJ Sugarman, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I was wondering if, for any of the panelists you'd like to address it, if you could talk a bit about the use of RAB or other state security forces in oppressing the opposition or others. There was a bit mentioned about their successes, but also the role they might play in the state suppression and the closing of the democratic space.
Okay. The gentleman at the front, please. Please be very brief, we're running almost late. Yeah.
I'm really, to some extent, from my deep down inside, I'm really a little bit upset to some extent about the analysis. And my question is about honest. Whenever the current political student wing of current political party is in power, they're killing the people at the day, even before the law enforcement agency. They're rampanting there, they're rampanting everything. There's killing people, they are destroying our education system. We have a lot of the problem, they created a lot of the problem with our education institution. And the RAB, as he mentioned, all of the law enforcement agency, they corrupted all the institution. How do you think that? Is it not the big issue for the, in terms of state terrorism that is going to happen in Bangladesh? They're killing people, everything, whatever doing. There post-year disappearance happening there. So do you think that how do you define the terms of the terrorism and counter-terrorism to eradicate them without the working with a legitimate government who can represent the whole Bangladeshi people? If you are just working with the people who are representing 5% of the Bangladeshi people and just making cooperation with them, do you think that in that way you can just eradicate the terrorism within the country?
Thank you. The lady in the back. I'm afraid this will be the last question because we are running out of time.
I'll be very brief. Swati here, live from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I just had a question about Bangladesh's challenges. I think I heard one speaker, the Undersecretary, speaking to the climate security challenge, and I think you all addressed the countering terrorism as another challenge. To what degree do you think that the Bangladesh government is evaluating those as two competing priorities, or do you perceive them as being sort of as being part of this at the same end of the same spectrum? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And I'm afraid we'll have to end the questions here. We turn back to our panelists, and each of the panelists can have about 2 minutes each. We'll go back in the reverse order. Shafqat.
Thank you. I think I had one question directly addressed to me about urban radicalization. Very briefly, urban radicalization is happening because of two particular reasons. One is the way the terrorist and extremist organizations are spreading their strategic communication, messaging, but also because of the fact that there is massive disaffection among the urban youth, the way the country is heading. There's disaffection about the lack of progress. There's disaffection about political quagmire that we find ourselves in right now. So the terrorist and extremist organizations are capitalizing on the disaffection and disenchantment among these youth groups, and by using clever strategic communication techniques are appealing to them.
Thank you. Dr. Lynch.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. I appreciate the questions, and I have to say that I kind of anticipated the emotion that might be associated here. So let me go back to the beginning of my comments and say the following. I was offering a regional perspective, and I was offering a perspective based upon what I have researched as being the perceptions of outside governments that work in the Bangladesh space and in the region. So I highlighted for you the UK government, the US government, and the Delhi government. And I think the facts of the matter are that when one looks from 2000 forward, as Shafqat has said, yes, and as the General said, one can point to agreements and principles that were put into place. Each of the governments I just referred to, though, felt that they were constrained in numerous ways in terms of how much help and assistance they could provide Bangladesh in the counter-terrorist framework that had been developed. That reluctance and reticence came in large part during the early parts of the 2000s because of what was referred to in this town as the BNP Jamaat government, right? And when I look at just one of the reports that were reasonably influential in this country and other countries during that time, from the International Crisis Group, let me just quote from you in 2010, their kind of summary as to how outside actors perceived that early period. Quote, the JMB was able, and this is from the Crisis Group report, and I mentioned this because this was a document that I saw on desks in each of the places I interviewed. Quote, the JMB was able to grow from 2001 to 2005 with either passive disinterest or sometimes active support from top officials within the Bangladesh National Party government. When the nature of the threat posed became clear after the 2005 bombings, Bangladesh security forces, and particularly the paramilitary Rapid Action Battalion, undertook a campaign of arrests that nearly succeeded in dismantling the organization. But the government's loss of focus and complacency allowed it to regroup. A second crackdown in 2008-2009 has already had some effects, blah, 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 blah. They went on to say that the crisis group, this is a 2010 report, felt fortunate that work ongoing between London, Delhi, and the United States was now able to find the space. And it was probably just coincidental that it was the Awami National Party that was there, because the kind of successive shocks to the system, the bombings in 2005 and other things, really led to an acknowledgement that JMB, an affiliate of Jamaat, an affiliate of the BNP government, was in fact the proponent of these issues, and everybody took steps to include the military against them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, having said that, let me just culminate with a full understanding that, one, if I had the same audience here that I had in late August when I was speaking at ORF in Calcutta, I would have a number of passions about this very topic that would be kind of flipped and reversed in terms of how Bangladesh politics plays out. So I understand the passions that are in the region. But let me just culminate with what I offer when I teach students at NDU or when I teach at Georgetown in South Asian security. That is that Bangladesh is in a wonderful position politically in terms of counterterrorism. Because one, as the General Machaf kind of said, every political party and the military has collaborated and cooperated with Western governments in terms of building a counterterrorism framework and a counterterrorism structure. And they have worked, and they've tried to work consistently in that direction. Flipping that coin over, though, every single party in the Bangladeshi government has at least some part of their history in the last 30 years as having been either closely affiliated with or perceived by outside parties to be facilitative of militant and terrorist organizations. So every party in Bangladesh has both sides of the coin. So my point is, don't misread my comments as labeling one party or the other more complicit or not. What I offer to you is kind of an outside perspective and maybe an explanation of why right now folks, to include the governments in London, this country, and Delhi, have become more comfortable in the last 5 to 6 years in the relationships they've developed in the counterterrorism intelligence sharing arena. That doesn't make them perfect, as we talked about their challenges forthcoming, but it does, I think, offer a perspective on how this current space and structure is looked at. And whether one likes it or not, I would argue to you that that's kind of the way the political consensus is right now in the research I've done over the last 3 years about the processes of counterterrorism in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Karim?
I'd like to make 3 quick comments. Number one, I don't think fighting terrorism is ever a purely technical problem. It is a political problem with complex political dimensions to it. So that's point one. Point two is that I think one of the fundamental problems with US foreign policy during the Cold War was the assumption that you can fight communism through ruthless suppressive authoritarian regimes. Regimes ranging from Indonesia's Suharto to Zaire's Mobutu were promoted for fighting communism. I don't know how effectively communism was fought, but democracy and human rights were the real victims in that process. So people who make the argument that you need to support, implicitly or explicitly, people who make the argument that you need to support authoritarian anti-democratic regimes in order to fight terrorism are basically falling the same trap. I don't think terrorism will be fought by supporting or promoting anti-democratic government. The real victims in that process would be democracy and human rights. And thirdly, I hope there's a general consensus on this table that the problem, the actual or potential problem of terrorism in Bangladesh needs to be seen outside the prism of a Bangladesh-Indian cooperation. India is an important partner in that process, but I think India's role needs to be decentered. I think other partners, and this process has been going on with varying degrees of success, like the United States, Western Europe, China, the Middle Eastern countries who are willing to fight terrorism, need to be brought into that equation, because it's a rather imbalanced dependence on India for fighting terrorism has all kind of dangerous implications. I think India is a regional power with a vested interest in maintaining regional domination, and Bangladesh's terrorism cannot be addressed adequately by inviting India to be the major partner in that process.
Yeah. Shafqat, you wanted to have a last
Yeah,
word?
I just wanted to quickly address the question that Swati asked about climate change and terrorism being two twin major challenges. That is right. I think all governments and the governments that we will have in the future recognize that both climate change and terrorism and violent extremism present a clear and present danger to Bangladesh's security. But climate change is fast emerging as an existential security challenge for Bangladesh because of some of the reasons that I explained earlier. So over the coming years, if we do a projection, I think a lot of our resources would be allocated to addressing climate change issues, but at the same time, counterterrorism or countering violent extremism would be a security priority for any government in the future.
Thank you. I think we are really running out of time, and we've had some very interesting discussions. I am sure you could go on and on, but we have to put an end to this. As the chair of the session, I would only like to say one thing. My personal understanding, take, and my research findings, none of the terrorist organizations in Bangladesh is an affiliate of any known political party. No political party directly affiliates with any terrorist organizations in Bangladesh. None of the major parties, none of the minor parties. So this is, as a chair, I would like to put this on record that I do not consider any political party which affiliates itself with a terrorist organization in Bangladesh, including the JMB. So with that statement, I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists this afternoon for a very wonderful presentations. Thank you.